Hey all, welcome back. Today I'll be discussing Insensatez, or Senselessness, by Horacio Castellanos Moya. This 2004 novel was my choice for El Salvador for my 1001 Nights of Reading Around the World. It is widely available in English if you're interested, and it connects directly to the play Antigone from the 3 Theban plays by Sophocles, which I also read for today's video and will hopefully discuss at the end if I have the stamina. So, yeah, this book was really interesting for a number of reasons, but the reason it connects is the epigraph. Right away, the book opens with an epigraph as a line from Ismene in the play Antigone. Nunca, Señor, perdura la sensatez en los que son desgraciados, ni siquiera la que nace con ellos, sino que se retira. It took me a long time to find which line that was in the corresponding line in my English translation here. But here it is. Yes, my lord, the mind we're born with doesn't abide when troubles sink our lives. It vanishes. And it's quite a different way of saying, but also just as ambiguously, or pointing to the fragility of our sanity. And that's really a lot of what this book is about, is the fragility of our sanity, especially in, well, I won't even say especially in the face of traumatic events, though that is part of it, as we are in the mind of a journalist working in the back of a cathedral in a country that is never explicitly named, but there are enough clues to tell us it is Guatemala, where this journalist is compiling and editing a huge document of testimonials from the massacre, the genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala that I didn't really do my research, so I don't know to what extent this is based on historical events or how controversial those events are. I am reading this as fiction. However, I do get the sense that not only is it perhaps very much coming from the author's experiences, but is also based on historical events of some kind. But it is also interesting because there is a lot in here that makes me think it's not exactly the author's direct experience either. It is still a work of fiction. The style itself actually reminded me a lot, and I don't know if this is because I just read him recently, of Thomas Bernhard. It's different, but they both kind of write in these, long run-on sentences, and they have this sort of repetition, although the repetition is much more contained within chapters. And yeah, this book, Horacio Castellanos Moya actually has chapters and paragraph breaks, though they are long paragraphs. But there are these sort of repeating refrains, like "Yo no estoy completo de la mente" is the first one. So the book opens up basically with our reliably unreliable narrator telling us he's unreliable. He says, "Yo no estoy completo de la mente, decía la frase que subrayé con el marcador amarillo." Not only is he telling us he is not sound of mind, he has underlined with a yellow highlighter that phrase. He, while working on this sort of document, throughout the book is going to become kind of increasingly paranoid. He is going to sort of chase a few different women that are kind of staying in the vicinity. Women from Spain, I believe, is kind of what they're implied to be, and they're definitely foreigners. And so there's this really kind of interesting mix of this journalist who's working on something very, very intense, right? He's reading these sort of testimonials of people watching their families getting hacked up before their eyes, right? Some really serious stuff. And he's like, right in the first chapter, he's observing, how can somebody like me be just doing this project and reading these things and be sound of mind. So I am the craziest person of all is basically the sentiment that he's telling us right away. And as the book goes on, we get the sense that, you know, we don't really know. It's a reversal of your typical, you know, you have a narrator that's crazy, but you only realize they're crazy as it goes on. This is almost the reverse, where you have a narrator that you know is probably crazy at the beginning, but then you're starting to wonder if he's actually right about some things as it goes on, and, you know, without spoiling the end. But it's a really interesting book in that way. There are a few, like, all of the scenes that are told about, like, from the genocide are sort of talked about in a removed sort of way, so that you know, you're hearing about them through the stories or the documents. Really, the whole book is very claustrophobic. You get it. You're just really in this one person's mind. You are with this narrator as he's doing the aforementioned things, and he doesn't really seem to be getting too far outside this sort of little central plaza that he's staying in, except for later in the book. But yeah, there's pretty much one exception to that. And so there's that claustrophobic sense, but then there are also another element of this book that I found really almost put me off it, is there are some very, like, graphic and kind of, like, intentionally gross, intimate encounters that the narrator has with women. And what I mean, I don't necessarily mean gross, like it's very detailed, but it's almost like in a way that's not supposed. They're uncomfortable, is the way I'm gonna put it, and yeah, I don't really know how to explain it in kind of an all age appropriate way, but these are scenes that in a lot of books would be like, unless an author has a really good reason for putting this kind of stuff in there, it shouldn't be there, right? And you're probably going to be thinking that on your first encounter with one of these scenes. There's two of them really. But the second one, I feel, kind of brought home to me a little bit of the intention behind it, and there's this certain obsession that the narrator has, sort of like, with this ideal of getting with these women, and then what actually happens when he gets with them, that seems to somehow be related to how he's removed from the testimonials of the genocide, but also seeing, like, poetic things in them. Like, he mentions, like, relates the poetry of Cesar Vallejo to the testimonials of people that, you know, saw people getting cut up by machetes and things like, and there's this strange kind of, there's definitely a perversity to it. There's definitely an element to this book of expressing, you know, thoughts that most people wouldn't say out loud ever. There's definitely that. But all of that makes it a really interesting book, even if it's not one that was, like, incredibly pleasant to read. And it wasn't a pleasant book to read. But again, a lot of the same feelings reading this book as reading, like, Correction by Thomas Bernhard, and that same sort of now, I do want to say the repetition stylistically works a little bit differently, that it's kind of contained within chapters. Like, it almost seems like, I don't think it's each chapter, but there's a lot of different chapters that have a refrain that will kind of repeat itself in the same paragraph or the same few paragraphs very close together. So the repetition is much more condensed rather than coming later in the book. The cyclical repetition is kind of contained within itself in each part, is what I'm trying to say. I almost feel like my review is kind of mimicking that style, so that's my excuse. But yeah, this is a really interesting book, and a standout one. A lot of parts that were quite squeamish, that were hard, just tough, like mentally tough to read when you really stop to, you didn't even have to stop to think about. Just this book is quite a shock to the system, even though it's quite short and doesn't. And that's another reason why it's like when there's certain scenes in this book that you're wondering like why. What is this? What is the point of this being here? When it's such a short book like this, you get the sense that everything in it connects to everything else. And by the end of it, I did feel that way. I didn't feel like anything that was done was unnecessary, and I felt like it was very rewarding for the amount of pages that it was. So with that, I have my reservations because I don't, you know, it's kind of like, I don't know, after reading around the world and reading a lot of stuff from different countries, I've definitely read my share of books that are just looking at the most miserable parts of the human experience. Though this one stands out by the way the narrator is kind of removed from it all, and his own mind kind of being a reflection of the insanity that he's trying to put together in this document that is his job. And of course, all of this, when you talk about the fragility of the human mind, you're also talking about the fragility of our politics, of our systems, of our countries. You're talking about the fragility of things at a mass scale as well, and the insane, horrible things people do on a mass scale as well as an individual. But like, okay, so once you've read like your share of those books, it's like you get to a point where it's like, okay, now I just want to, you know, I want to bring positivity into my life, you know, and it's hard. It gets harder to put yourself through this sort of very, very negative experience, even though I sometimes wonder, like, is that a good thing? Is being able with a sound mind to confront a book about such unsound minds? I'm trying to translate the title into English, you know, insensitez. Like, to confront such senselessness and insanity, does that make me insane to be choosing to read a book like this? It almost like the book makes you ask that question. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at, is like, how much more of this just dwelling in the sort of darkest parts of humanity does one need to do? What's the amount that's appropriate? What's when you don't necessarily have to do it? But of course, I'm sure there's someone somewhere right now who is dwelling within the worst part of humanity, and that's just a reality of the existence we live in. And so, yeah, I don't really have a strong conclusion to this one. Just an interesting book. Reading the Greek plays, the 3 plays by Sophocles. Now, it's interesting that in this collection, the order is Oedipus the King, Antigone, and Oedipus at Colonus. That is the order that they were written by Sophocles, but the actual chronological order of the story is Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and then Antigone. I have both read and listened to these plays over the last 5 days, all 3 of them. I read them in the order that's in the book, so the order that Sophocles wrote them, and then I listened to them in the order that they are of the story, the story order. So I can't really decide what I like better, because Oedipus at Colonus, while it is in the middle, feels like a much different sort of play than Oedipus the King and Antigone. Now, I'm just kind of rambling here about what order should you read them, right? That's what I guess I was trying to give some good advice on that. Whatever. What's interesting about them, okay? Oedipus the King, when I read it, that was the first, of course, that I read, and I was kind of blown away. And this happens so often with the classics. Like, I knew that Oedipus was like this guy that he unintentionally kills his father and marries his mother, and then basically destroys himself by trying to because he can't stop uncovering the truth of what happened. Okay. But it was really a lot more rich than that. There were a lot more details going on, a lot more side characters that have interesting kind of decisions that they make and their parts that they played in all of this happening. And I think probably the strongest line, and it could be one of the most quoted for all I know, is something like paraphrasing here, like how like wisdom is useless to one who gets no benefit from it. And that's kind of, I guess, the whole driving story of Oedipus, is that it's like, why do you keep needing to know something? You keep digging, you keep needing to know more when it's not actually doing any benefit to you. I think about this in different ways. It's like, until we know the truth, we don't actually know if it's going to be beneficial for us or not. So that's one argument to keep digging. The other argument is like Cervantes in that story within the story of Don Quixote, the Curioso Impertinente, where a man basically tests his wife, uses his best friend to test his wife's fidelity, and then ends up basically destroying his own marriage and life. And it's kind of like, if you're happy, don't mess with it, that sort of thing too. So sometimes just seeking knowledge for knowledge's sake, it's like, is that truly good? But this is a very specific self-knowledge we're talking about. Like Oedipus almost in the story seems unbendingly, or in this play, he seems just unbendingly like fixed on finding his own guilt in this whole thing. And I think that's why this is such a resonating story through the ages, because it just digs at kind of just really the deepest depths of shame in the human psyche. And I think we also get some of that in we get sort of opposing viewpoints from Jocasta, who's trying to say, his wife and mother, who's trying to say like, no, stop digging, and so it's just this whole kind of, I'm trying to get more of an appreciation this year for plays, and actually I had the idea to read. I have all of the Shakespeare plays on in audio form. But I thought, well, why don't I just read those while listening to them at the same time? That's harder with Greek plays because you need to make sure you have the same translations. But I'm like, there's really no holdup for that with Shakespeare. And then you can much more easily imagine the whole thing playing out before you. But I really think I've underestimated the power of plays and how important they are. And I think the more I'm thinking about it, that was one of my really formative experiences growing up, was being in plays. I don't even think that I could be doing this like speaking, even though it's in front of a camera and I can take as many takes as I want, but just any ability that I had whatsoever in my life to speak in front of people, because I was a rather introverted person, was like all from plays, being in plays when I was younger. And like it develops you in, building the sets and memorization and creativity. It's such a music. It's such a well-rounded form of art, and I feel like I've really underestimated that. So that's something I want to keep paying attention to in the future. I think plays are really powerful mediums, and just as much as reading and literature, I think it's a medium we should be fighting to keep alive in our communities, especially for young people. And there's a whole social element when you're in a play too, that I remember when I was younger, you make friends, and it's just there's so much good to it. And not saying like you have to go and make theater like your profession or something. Just do it in school if you have the opportunity, or in local communities. That's kind of Anyway, back to Antigone. No, Oedipus at Colonus. That is really the play in this cycle that stands out to me as quite different, because at first I was like, this one is just the most boring of the plays. It was the third that I read, even though it's the second in the story. But I was just like, wow, this one is just so much less fast-paced, it's like... But there are some really interesting things about it. Oedipus now has blinded himself and gone off into the wilderness, and he is approaching Athens, where he then, is near Athens at this village Colonus, and Theseus eventually comes to him and welcomes him as a friend. And basically the whole story seems kind of to be some kind of like lore building for how Athens became the mightiest city. But the way this is done is through almost, redeeming Oedipus in the glory of Athens. Because at the end of it, spoiler, Oedipus basically says to Theseus, at the beginning he says, Theseus, if you help me, I will do something great for your city. Well, what this great thing is, he leads Theseus to the site where Oedipus will die and be buried, and we never know exactly what happens to Oedipus, but Theseus walks away covering his eyes like he's seen some kind of cosmic horror. It's even referred to into the play as if the gate of Hades opened up and took Oedipus, or like a messenger of the gods came down and brought and took, or something like... Theseus has seen something he should never have seen, and he's not allowed to reveal this to anybody but his sons. And therefore, as long as the secret of where and how Oedipus died and was buried, I guess, lasts, that is how Athens will carry on. As long as that secret is safe, Athens will remain the glorious place that it is. So I almost wonder if Sophocles, in writing this play, woke up some curious minds that went and eventually found the hiding place of Oedipus, or the burying place of Oedipus, and then that's why Athens had the Peloponnesian War and their downfall. And okay, that's just my... it's a fun story. It'd be a fun story, wouldn't it? But anyway, that's why I thought Oedipus at Colonus was interesting. Just this whole sort of... this lore building for Athens, and then also, that Sophocles in his day was doing, and sort of also how the whole play builds up to this almost mystical, religious, redemptive moment for Oedipus that I was not expecting, honestly was not expecting. And in that way, I almost do feel it is a fitting final work of the three to read. But Antigone, of course, being the last chronologically, follows much more closely Antigone and her sister Ismene, who, as contrasting characters, are both very interesting in this. I think one of the most interesting lines is when Antigone says that the reason she chooses to bury her brother against the wishes of Creon, which leads to her execution, or ordered execution, is this here. Saying to Ismene, when Ismene is trying to convince her not to do this because she's going to get killed, I will not plead with you, and if you change your mind, I won't welcome your assistance later. No, be what seems best to you, and I will bury him myself, and so die nobly. I'll lie beside him in love, guilty of devotion, for I must please the dead a longer time than I must please the living. With them I'll lie forever. But you, go on, dishonor what's honored by the gods. And it's this idea of that line, almost more than any, helped me understand this sort of or I don't know, maybe framed in a new light, because obviously I've known about it, but this idea of why are people so obsessed with giving others a proper burial throughout history, and why has humanity always been so concerned with how they die, and so actually Montaigne has an essay about that, which has always matched more to my viewpoint, that what happens to my body after I'm dead is none of my business, right? But and a lot of people say it's more for the living than the dead, is the funeral, right? But it's also kind of like this puts into a different perspective this idea of eternity, that the human mind can conceive of in something that is eternal, and to think that, if there are spirits beyond the dead, this life is so fragile and so temporary that we seek the eternal in so many varied and different ways, because we're going to be with the dead an infinite, much longer time than we are with the living. And so that really is just a new way to frame, or I guess a new way to say this. I don't know. I just really enjoy, that's my favorite line of Antigone. For I must please the dead a longer time than I must please the living. With them I'll lie forever. But yeah, the whole play, of course, it's tragic, and I don't know. There's better people, scholars and stuff out there that can talk about these plays much better than I can. I guess I just wanted to share a few of my favorite lines and some reflections, and yeah, this was a great book to connect it to, because honestly there were like 4 or 5 books in a row that I picked up in sequence and thought about like starting to read them. Anna Komnena's Alexiad was one of them, and all of them, like 4 or 5 books in a row, all mentioned Sophocles or had a quote from Sophocles, and specifically quotes and mentions from his plays, his Theban plays. And so I said, this is just a sign, this is a sign that I need to read Sophocles. Not necessarily a mystical sign, just a very clear sign from my ancestors, human ancestors, that and contemporaries, that I need to read Sophocles. But there you have it. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Mike Reads the World.